Kaya Wanju. My name is James Ivanatakis and I'm the Director of the Forest Research Foundation, who along with the University of Western Australia's Public Policy Institute are hosting partners for this evening's very important and special event. I would like to welcome you all here at the University of Western Australia. Before proceeding, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that we are on Wajak Noongar Boodja and pay respects to elders past and present. And I'd like to make the point that we acknowledge country not because we have to, but because we want to. Because we want to join the custodians of this beautiful land on a 60,000-year journey. What a beautiful tradition that we're part of, and what an honour to be part of it. Welcome to you all for the launch of Minister Tony Buti's latest book, A Considered Act, How Voluntary Assisted Dying Became Legal in Western Australia. Before proceeding, I want to take a moment to recognise some of our special guests. Of course, the Honorary Roger Cook, Premier of Western Australia, who will be officially launching Minister Buti's book. The Honorary Tony Buti himself, the Attorney General, Minister for Commerce, Tertiary and International Education, Multicultural Interests. The many other honorary ministers, both past and present, for attendance this evening. Those Director Generals and senior public officials. Professor Ahmed Chakma, Vice-Chancellor and President of the University of Western Australia, and other senior members of the university. I also want to take a moment to extend and recognise the many community advocacy groups that are represented here, including the people who have had personal experience of voluntary assisted dying. Before introducing Professor Chakma to formally welcome you, a few notes about the event flow and housekeeping. After Professor Chakma's introduction, Premier Cook will officially launch Mr Buti's book. We'll have a chance to hear from the Minister himself. After formal proceedings, book purchases can be made from the tables outside, and I believe that Minister Buti will be willing to sign some more books. I just made that up. It's not in my notes, but I've never met an author who doesn't enjoy signing a book, so... Just also, I've been asked to make the note that in case of emergency, please note your nearest exits, and the muster point is the oak garden just behind us, directly in front of me. So, it is now my pleasure to invite the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Western Australia, Professor Ahmed Chakma, to the lectern to formally begin proceedings and officially welcome you. Please join me in welcoming Professor Chakma.
Hi, Wangju. Good evening. Thank you, James, and thank you all for being with us tonight. I understand that there are about 350 people who have registered, so it's a full house. Wonderful to see all of you this evening. I would also like to acknowledge that we're meeting on the lands of the Wajak people of the Noongar Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. We are indeed very privileged that our university sits here on Wajak Noongar Boodja, alongside the beautiful Derval Aragon. It is an absolute pleasure for me to welcome one of our most distinguished alumni, the Honourable Dr. Tony Buti, back to UWA for the launch of his latest book. I'm sure that many of you were here some years back in 2021, for the launch of his previous book, The Incredible Al-Kira. Minister, you set yourself a very high benchmark with that one. So let's see how this one compares to that. As a side note, Minister also set a very high benchmark for a very busy minister with all the responsibilities, who continues to produce books after books. And you are an envy of us in academia. We are having a hard time coping with your pace, Minister. The University of Western Australia is proud to be associated with the launch of this book particularly, and this book is about an incredible milestone in our state's history. Since 1911, the time of our founding, our mission has been to advance the prosperity and welfare of our communities, a mission that very much is aligned with the landmark legislation, which is the subject of Dr. Buti's book. However, my main role this evening is to introduce our Premier, who needs no introduction. The Honourable Roger Cook MLA is the 31st Premier of Western Australia. He was elected member for Kinana in 2008 and currently holds the title of Premier, Minister of State, Industry Development, Jobs and Trade, and Minister for Public Sector Management, State and Federal Relations, along title. However, we all will remember him as a health minister. Under his leadership, our state ended up being one of the safest jurisdictions on the face of the planet. And of course, we all benefited from it. So you know all about the Premier. I'm going to highlight a few things that you may not be as familiar with. All good, Premier. So Premier Cook is a champion of higher education. This may be news to you. In his previous role, he was actually science minister. And as science minister, he knew about many activities taking place on our various campuses. And he has visited us many times, including funding probably one of the coldest refrigerators that you can find in Western Australia in the basement of our physics building. You remember that? And he understands that universities need to play important roles in our economic diversification efforts now and into the future. He's a visionary leader in that respect and gave us a minister responsible for tertiary and international education. So focus on those two important areas. And chose a very knowledgeable person in Minister Buti to lead the portfolio, an individual who actually knows the sector very well. So with that, would you please join me in welcoming our Premier to the university and to the podium.
Thank you, Ahmed. Thank you very much, everyone, for the opportunity to join you this evening. It's an incredible turnout. I can only assume, Tony, that you've offered free drinks after. But I want to begin by acknowledging that we are on Whadjuk Noongar country, and it's appropriate that we acknowledge the traditional owners of this land and their elders past and present. Can also take the opportunity just to acknowledge other people in the room. The Honourable Malcolm McCusker, former Governor, the former Premier of Western Australia, the Honourable Mark McGowan. I've seen my Cabinet colleague, the Honourable David Michaels, in the room. Now, I was going to acknowledge all the other parliamentarians and former parliamentarians that are here this evening. Sorry, and Honourable Matt Swinburne, a Cabinet colleague. But there's more members of Parliament here tonight than at the Parliament House dining room buffet. So can I take the opportunity just to acknowledge you all, both current and former members of Parliament. It's wonderful to see such a great turnout to really, I think, tonight celebrate that time when I think Western Australia's Parliament was at its best. Can I acknowledge James, and the Director of the Forest Research Foundation, and of course the Honourable Tony Buti MLA, and his wife Mandy and children Tennessee and Alkira. It's an honour to be here at UWA this evening for the launch of Tony Buti's book. If you have a niggling feeling of deja vu, don't worry, you're not alone. This is in fact the 6th book authored by the Honourable Dr. Tony Buti, not to mention the journal articles, the textbooks bearing his name. But dare I say it, the book that we're launching today, A Considered Act, is quite possibly his best yet. And that's nothing to do with the fact that I'm mentioned 142 times in 40 chapters. It's also nothing to do with the fact that he wrote the book while serving as a Minister for the Crown. Now, I know there's some former Attorney Generals in the room tonight, and I think we're all wondering how you found the time to do that, Tony, but we'll have a talk about that later on. But it's also amongst his best because it's another deep dive into a sensitive subject from the mighty pen of Dr. Tony Buti. The title, A Considered Act, is a very elegant way of describing what the book is really about, and that is death and human pain. Now that may sound a bit jarring, and it may not be the description written on the approved back cover, but it is in fact death and human pain which has been topics of intrigue since the beginning of humankind. In literature, like Shakespeare, who maniacally explored the physical and emotional suffering that accompanies death. In art, like Vincent van Gogh's portrait at Eternity's Gate, depicting the sorrow of ageing and end of life. Or, more commonly, in our consumption of daily news, which is replete with stories of suffering. Despite the fact that we are so often confronted with the realities of death and suffering in our daily lives, it is not often something which is openly discussed. After all, no one likes to imagine a loved one dying. No one likes to imagine a loved one suffering, let alone talk about it, let alone witness it. Therefore, it's even rarer that these deeply personal matters can be part of an informed public policy debate. Parliaments make laws about all manner of things. There are acts for just about everything. We have acts specifically for cats and dogs. And until 2016, the Potato Marketing Corporation could penalise anyone for carrying more than 50 kilograms of spuds. So often, the issues we debate are nails and the law is a hammer. Not so much with voluntary assisted dying. This is a debate that occurred at the intersection of so many systems of belief, of morals, of faith, our philosophy around individual autonomy and choice, while quite literally a matter of life and death. Tony begins the book by exploring the heart-wrenching personal stories or tragedies that formed the catalyst for public discussion around VAD. But the crux of the book focuses on the collision of these stories with competing beliefs and a public policy response. My good friend and colleague Tony has never been afraid to explore the tough subjects, and that's what this book homes in on. The uniquely Western Australian path to legislating for people that have this end-of-life choice should they be diagnosed with a terminal illness. The book spans a time when I was either the Shadow Minister for Health or the Health Minister. My reflections of the time are somewhat clouded due to the global pandemic that arrived there shortly after. I'm therefore grateful for a considered act has been able to fill in some of the blanks. It's something I'm immensely proud to say that I was part of, not just as a Member of Parliament, but as a member of the Western Australian community. I heard so many stories from so many people over the course of the debate, from opposition to government, to assembling the expert panel, to forming the bill and eventually enacting it. So I say this is a moment for which the community should be proud. I said in one of my speeches during the course of the debate that Western Australia was not often renowned for its socially progressive legislation, let alone its informed social policy debate. And indeed, we weren't the first state in Australia to enact voluntary assisted dying legislation. But we came a respectful second. And for that, we should be very proud. I remember when I was first elected in 2017 in government and as the Minister for Health, and I was asked by a journalist, so what about voluntary assisted dying? And I sort of said, sure, it makes sense to me. Little did I know that that would be the front page headline the next day. I remember Mark McGowan's policy, media advisor at the time said, actually, you're in government now. It actually matters what you say. But I'm immensely grateful for the leadership of Mark and the team to provide the space for this debate to take place. Mark was responsible for encouraging the Honourable Amber Jade Sanderson to chair a select committee into exploring the possibility that we might have this legislation within Western Australia. And that committee provided a pathway forward to then undertaking the task of drafting the legislation. And I want to take an opportunity just to acknowledge all the people in the room and outside this room that had a part to play in this extraordinary act of compassion by the Western Australian community. The drafters, the consultants, the health experts, the policy analysts, the people who undertook the extraordinary consultation process. We had Malcolm McCusker undertaking the most extraordinary exercise of consultation, ensuring that everyone in Western Australia had an opportunity to debate and to be part of this community conversation that we had around voluntary assisted dying. And then the actual debate itself was one of which I had great pride, not because we got the legislation through, but because of the journey that that legislation took through the Parliament. And I see around the room former members of Parliament on both sides who conducted themselves with great sensitivity, with great compassion, with genuine intellectual curiosity. And ultimately we got to the point where we had the legislation and it passed with a comfortable majority in both houses. And I think the fact that it did get through with such a thumping majority and overwhelming support of the members of Parliament speaks to the fact that many people in the community and certainly many members of Parliament could see themselves in this legislation, could see that part that they could relate to, could see that bit that they contributed to see the very thoughts and ideas that we all had come together in a great piece of law. So the passing of the Voluntary Assisted Dying Act of 2019 does feel like a lifetime ago. So much has occurred in the interim years. As an elected representative, the one that strikes me most is the growth in a cynicism and derision aimed at our trusted institutions. I wonder if we could have the same nuanced, sympathetic, sensitive and compassionate debate today. You see the attacks on the public sector, on universities, on experts. As we cast an eye to the US, we're witnessing one of the biggest attacks on institutions in our modern history. Moves that undervalue the role of the public sector, academics and experts, driven by ideological and misplaced views. However, this book can serve as a permanent reminder to the people of Western Australia that our trusted institutions, like governments, can achieve incredible things. And as Bismarck observed, while it's not always pleasant to see how the sausage gets made, the results are worthwhile. More than 730 individuals have exercised their right to access voluntary assisted dying. There's no quantifying the amount of suffering and pain cut short by that number. There's no quantifying the amount of family members and friends that didn't have to bear witness to more pain. What can be made clear is that Western Australians now have the choice. Tony's book provides the first thorough history of how Western Australia arrived at that important point. And just as he did with his previous book, Alkira, he's told a story that needed to be told, and we'll be forever grateful for it. Thank you.
Thank you to both the Premier and Professor Chakma for those words. Premier, I particularly note your remarks about the Parliament being at its best, about having informed, nuanced public debate, and about the journey that you all took together. Having read the book, these sentiments are beautifully captured in Minister Buti's dedication, which is as follows, and I quote, "The book is dedicated to the members of the 40th Western Australian Parliament, the public service that advised them, and the parliamentary management and staff who supported and serviced them during the parliamentary debate on the Voluntary Assisted Dying Bill." It truly captures what is best of what we hope from our parliamentarians, working with ideological friends and foes alike to deliver something for the public good. I'm now honoured to invite the Honorary Tony Buti to speak on his new book. As mentioned, Minister Buti is Western Australia's Attorney-General, Minister for Commerce, International and Tertiary Education, Citizenship and Multicultural Interests. I recently had the pleasure of having an informal lunch with Minister Buti with Dr. Merve Emery, who's the Forest Research Foundation's Thinker-in-Residence. Professor Emery is a literary critic of the New Yorker magazine and Professor of Literary Criticism at Wesleyan University in the United States. After lunch, as we sat in the Uber heading back home, she turned around and she said to me, "I like Tony, if I may, Minister." She said, quote, "He's someone who is not afraid of confronting challenging issues with a sense of humility and humanity." She paused, turned around and looked at me and said, "Geez, we could use him in the US right now." Please join me in welcoming Minister Buti.
Thank you very much, James. Thank you, Amit. Also, thank you to the University of Western Australia and the Public Policy Institute for hosting this book launch. And a particular thank you to those that have expended considerable labour in putting this launch together tonight, including Associate Professor Paul Magin, Ben Pertz, Claire Fennin and Harriet Cavalier. And of course, thank you very much, Premier, the Honourable Roger Cook, for officially launching the book and for your outstanding contribution to the debate that hopefully this book captures. As you can see, we've got a full house tonight, and I thank all of you for being here. And I'd like to acknowledge all of you, especially the VIPs, but there's too many, from politics, the judiciary, the public service, academia, the legal and medical professions and others. But you being here means a lot to me. As I said, I'd like to acknowledge you all, but I can't. But I do have a special shout out to my current and former parliamentary colleagues, including several cabinet ministers, the various Director Generals who minister my portfolio responsibilities, and to my wonderful ministerial and electoral staff. And can I specifically acknowledge the presence of the Honourable Mark McGowan? There was a seat for here down here for you, Mark. The Premier of Western Australia during the passage of the Voluntary Assisted Dying Bill through State Parliament. And of course, a book launch must have a book. I may be the author of this book, A Considered Act, How Voluntary Assisted Dying Became Legal in Western Australia, but many people assisted with the final product. And I acknowledge many of them in the back of the book, and for those that I have not mentioned but you have helped in some way, I apologise for your omission and thank you for your contributions. Before moving on, can I thank the over 70 people I interviewed for this book, including many of my parliamentary colleagues, and of course, Margaret Bilby and Noreen Finn, who are both here tonight. Your contribution makes this book more powerful. Your generosity is much appreciated, and thank you very much. Also, a special thank you to my fabulous editor, Leela Jabor. You were great to work with, and also the great team at the Australian Scholarly Publishing Company in Melbourne. And of course to my beautiful wife, Mandy, and my children, Alkira and Tennessee, and to Ella and to Ella's family for being here. Thank you for your love and support. The speakers that preceded me this evening have already acknowledged the traditional owners of the land we meet on. I also make that acknowledgement, but it reminds me that for many Aboriginal people, there was some cultural unease around the issue of voluntary assisted dying. But just as in the non-Aboriginal population, there is a variety of views and positions. One of the first people to use Western Australia's new Voluntary Assisted Dying Act 2019, which came into effect on the 1st of July 2021, was Yamaji woman Mary Ellen Passmore. Passmore, who had motor neuron disease, passed away in a Perth hospital on Thursday, the 29th of July 2021, surrounded by her family and medical staff singing Alleluia. Her family subsequently released a statement which read in part, "The doctors made sure right until the end that this was what she wanted. The care and compassion provided by the doctors made a big difference." Before passing away, Passmore herself said, "I feel at peace within myself. I have the love of my children and they are saying, 'Yes, Mum, you have had enough.'" Voluntary assisted dying is part of the legal regime of the state of Western Australia. How we got to this stage is the story of this book. I was motivated to write this book because the passing of the Voluntary Assisted Dying Bill is arguably the most important and consequential social legislation to pass the Parliament of Western Australia, whether one supports or opposes voluntary assisted dying. In my view, it is important that such important political, social and legal events be recorded in a form that is accessible to as many people in the community. A considered act is my account gathered largely from interviews and personal observations of the parliamentary debate and community campaign. At 6:05 p.m. on the 10th of December 2019, the Parliament of Western Australia formally passed the Voluntary Assisted Dying Bill with its 55 amendments. By the time the bill had finally passed, members of Parliament across both houses, the Legislative Assembly and the Legislative Council, had spent more than 175 hours closely scrutinising and debating what was arguably the most significant piece of social reform legislation any of them would deal with in their parliamentary careers. The parliamentary process had commenced on the 6th of August 2019 when Health Minister Roger Cook rose in Parliament to give notice of the motion to read the bill into Parliament the following day. But more accurately, the parliamentary process commenced back in August 2017 when Cabinet Secretary Amber J. Sanderson moved a motion in the lower house for the establishment of the Joint Committee on End-of-Life Choices. Sanderson would chair the committee and she would be joined by fellow Labor lower house members Rhys Whitby and Simon Millman and Liberal member John McGrath. They would be joined by Upper House National Party member Colin Holt, who would serve as Deputy Chair, Labor's Sally Talbot, Greens Robin Chappell and Liberals Nick Goran. In regards to Robin Chappell, he had unsuccessfully sought to introduce legislation to legalise voluntary assisted dying in previous parliamentary terms. He was also part of a cross-party group with Labor's Alana Mateenan and Liberals' Tony Simpson, who had agreed to work together to advocate for the legalising of voluntary assisted dying. Over the enduring 12 months, the Select Committee would have hearings here in Perth and in the regions and receive over 700 written submissions supporting and opposing the legalising of voluntary assisted dying. I also make special mention of the Secretariat who served the committee with commitment and professionalism, working long hours. On the Thursday morning of the 23rd of August 2018, Sanderson tabled the Select Committee's report titled My Life, My Choice. In speaking to the report, Sanderson concluded, "The committee recommends that the government legislate for voluntary assisted dying in Western Australia." Members of the House sat for a moment in silent contemplation. Throughout the chamber, there was an acute awareness that this was a significant moment, which was going to be the beginning of what would be a very challenging and emotional undertaking. Much was still to happen before any bill would be presented by all members present, but all members present understood that before the election, the next election due in 2021, they will be voting on this bill, and that their own conscience would be tested. At the same time as Sanderson was on her feet, Colin Holt tabled the report in the upper house. Nick Goran also tabled his minority report opposing the legalising of voluntary assisted dying. The majority report also recommended the establishment of an expert panel of health and legal practitioners and health consumers to develop legislation for the legalising of voluntary assisted dying in Western Australia. In a masterstroke decision by the Health Minister and the Premier, the government appointed former Governor of West Australia and the leader of the Perth Bar, Malcolm McCusker QC, to lead the ministerial expert panel. The ministerial expert panel delivered its final report to Minister Cook in time for him to table it in Parliament on the 27th of June 2019, the last parliamentary sitting day before the 5-week winter recess. It included 31 recommendations that would inform the drafting of the voluntary assisted dying bill. But drafting on the bill had already commenced, but would heat up over the winter recess, ready for introduction when Parliament resumed in August. McGowan, Cook and Attorney General John Quigley and their advisers went into overdrive in the winter recess, discussing and debating the contents of the bill to be brought back to Parliament. The Premier and his 2 ministers and Sanderson and advisers worked tirelessly over the winter recess. The Premier was so impressed by the advisers who had such deep knowledge on the issues and details. During the winter recess and continuing once the bill was introduced into Parliament, parliamentarians were receiving correspondence and representations from numerous people and organisations supporting and opposing the bill. One email I received that attracted my attention was as follows. It is with great sorrow that you, as a medical practitioner, having taken the Hippocratic Oath, endorse the euthanasia bill. Human life is sacred, murder is forbidden. The weak and infirm are to be treated with dignity, honour and respect. The notion that we should have full control over the timing and manner of our death is misplaced. None of us knows when our life may end and what the cause may be. Euthanasia does not give control over death, but gives into it. I am surmising that you are of Italian descent. Your forefathers certainly would not endorse the taking of one's own life. Please reconsider, Dr. Buti. You too are accountable to your Creator. The email was interesting to me on several fronts. First, the writer had mistakenly viewed me as a medical doctor, presumably because I have the title doctor that appears before my name, but that's courtesy of a doctorate in the field of law. Secondly, they assumed that those of Italian heritage would most likely be against voluntary euthanasia. I don't know whether that is true or not. I doubt it. And finally, the most intriguing part of the email was the implicit assumption that I was a supporter of legalising voluntary assisted dying. At the time I received the email, I had made no public declaration of how I intended to vote on the bill. The writer had automatically put me in the yes camp, perhaps because I was a member of the Labor Party. Had the writer done some research, they would have realised that while support for legalising voluntary assisted dying was stronger on the Labor side of politics than it was within the Liberal Party, there was in fact members for and against on both sides. And in respect to the National Party, there were strong supporters in Parliament for the legalising of voluntary assisted dying. In fact, 5 of the 6 National Party members of the lower house were supportive of legalising voluntary assisted dying, and all upper house members voted in favour of the bill. The only National Party member opposed to the bill was Shane Love, who threatened to resign from the National Party if a proposed motion at their party conference to make supporting VAD official party policy was successful. One person who was acutely aware that individual members' position was still shifting, much less fixed along party lines, was Linda Oshlam. In her role as Dying with Dignity's WA's Yes campaign strategist, she continued to monitor the state of play on all sides. Oshlam had learned her craft in the rough and tumble of New South Wales Labor politics before moving to Western Australia, and her political astuteness and campaigning skills were clear. She was such an asset for Dying with Dignity WA, as was Joey Armeti, who was employed by Go Gentle. established by media personality Andrew Denton to advocate for the legalising of voluntary assisted dying. Amenti had worked for former Premier Colin Barnett and had deep connections and relationships with members of the Liberal Party. Another lobbyist to have an important role to play was Amanda Reid. With the AMA WA welcoming a new leadership team of President Dr Andrew Miller and CEO Dr Benny Ning, Reid was engaged to assist the AMA to have influence in the final determination of the details of the bill. They had left their run very late, not becoming fully engaged until the bill had passed the lower house and was now in the upper house. But with the assistance of Reid, Ning and Miller, were able to have some very important meetings with Roger Cook and Amber J. Sanderson. Further, Neil Fergus, Cook's Chief of Staff, played an important role in keeping the communication channels open with the AMA. In the 175 hours of parliamentary debate, members and observers witnessed the best of Parliament. While at times tempers frayed, some of the speeches from members were truly outstanding. I could stand here and articulate many of the outstanding speeches, but I won't. You need to buy the book. But in relation to the lower house, I thought the second reading speech by long-term parliamentarian and police minister Michelle Roberts was very moving. She spoke passionately about why she firmly opposed the bill, sharing a very moving personal story involving former Labor member for the East Metropolitan Region, Banton. Please read the book to find out more of that speech. In the upper house, the second reading speeches of Alana Martinan, Sally Talbot and Green's Alison Zembon were emotionally powerful and intellectually impressive. But I don't think I would be alone in assessing that Matthew Swinburne's speech was the most moving. As he relayed his son Mitchell's health journey, tears were flowing freely from some of his colleagues. A passenger on a tram in Melbourne streaming Swinburne's speech on her phone tweeted about its raw power. It would be remiss of me if I did not acknowledge the incredible stamina, patience, commitment and professionalism of Minister Roger Cook, the Health Minister. During the consideration in detail stage of the bill, he never lost his cool. He was able to take some brief breaks, replaced by Premier McGowan and Attorney General Quigley, but he was in the chair for most of the debate. And during the daytime shifts, there were many nighttime shifts, including one parliamentary day that flowed into dawn the next morning. The government were very strategic in having one of their advisors on the floor of Parliament. That happened to be Malcolm McCusker. His expertise was very much welcomed by Minister Cook. Minister Cook was tested by numerous questions he received on the details of the 184 clauses of the bill. Most of the questions came from the opposition benches, but he was also tested by his own Labor side at times, particularly by Margaret Quirk, who opposed the bill. Quirk, a lawyer by profession and with one of the sharpest and refined analytical minds in Parliament, tested Cook. While Cook at times was frustrated by her questioning, he had great admiration for Margaret's intellect. In general, the government and supporters of the bill were confident that the bill would pass the lower house, which it did with a solid majority. The supporters of the bill were concerned with the numbers in the upper house and also the possible tactics of Nick Guerin. On the morning of the 15th of October 2019, the day the bill's second reading was due to resume in the upper house after a 2-week parliamentary break, the West Australian newspaper reported that first-term Liberal member for North Metropolitan Region, Jorn Sigmar, now intended to vote in favour of the proposed legislation. With the tightest of margins predicted, the article explained Sigmar's vote could be a game changer. Sigmar's newfound support for the bill, which he attributed to a recent profoundly affecting conversation he had had with Norma Christensen, aunt of National member Peter Rundle, surprised Oshlin, who had placed Sigmar firmly in the no camp. But it was more than a surprise for Sigmar's Liberal Party colleague Nick Guerin. Shock would have been a better description. While Guerin was a nemesis in the side of those supporting the bill, many of those supporters did admire his intellect. Sally Talbot, whose views on voluntary assisted dying and many other issues were diametrically opposed to those held by Quran, has said of him, "He is a man who has some very strong beliefs, and he backs them up with well-researched evidence. I wish there were more people around who treated the evidence like he does. He is a worthy opponent in many ways. When you argue with Nick, you are arguing about the nature of evidence, the validity of the evidence, which is not the case with a lot of people." However, Talbot's admiration for Quran had its limits. As the upper house protracted debate on clause 1 of the bill entered its 4th day, Talbot, her patience exhausted, rose to make a point of order. With the chamber still debating clause 1 of 184 clauses, Talbot said, "If the Honourable Nick Quran keeps proceeding at this rate, it will take us between 9 and 10 years to get through this bill." And the person in the hot seat for the government who had carriage of the bill in the upper house was Minister Stephen Dawson, Deputy Leader of the government in the Legislative Council. Premier McGowan had selected Dawson to carry the bill through the upper house, rather than the House Leader of the government business, Sue Allery. While neither Dawson nor Allery were informed of the reason for the Premier's choice, and I assume also the Health Minister's choice, they were both well aware that Dawson was known for his moderate temperament and respected by all members regardless of politics. Well, I hope so. Allery herself supported the Premier's decision, acknowledging, "I think the truth is Stephen is seen as a much nicer and easier person to get along with. If he and I have a job-sharing role, he is the good cop and I'm the bad cop. And I'm perfectly relaxed about that. His level of patience is far greater than mine." In the event, the choice of Stephen Dawson to successfully shepherd the legislation through the upper house would ultimately win acclaim from all sides. After the voluntary assisted dying bill came back to the lower house and was passed on the 10th of December 2019, some parliamentarians joined the celebratory gathering by supporters of voluntary assisted dying on the front steps of Parliament. Appropriately, the three drivers of the process, McGowan, Cook and Sanderson, supported by Quigley and Dawson, were there. Cook was happy but restrained. "It's good that this is over. It has been a long haul. I'm happy with the result." Sanderson had a cocktail of feelings. "It's been such a long journey. I feel very emotional, pleased and relieved, but also flat. It's hit me that it's now all over." For McGowan, the moment was one of subdued political triumph. For his Labor government, it was certainly a win, but above all, he saw it as a triumph of compassion for those for whom the need would be greatest. "On behalf of all those people who cared about the bill, I didn't want to lose for them," he would later reflect. "The importance of not losing for them hit me as I saw the gathering outside Parliament, with all those people there with the banner, and there was cheering and excitement, hugging and shaking hands. I remember seeing a lady down there who had a terminal illness. I know she has died since, but she said, 'The bill won't help me, but I'm happy.'" Writing in the Sunday Times only yesterday, Ben Harvey wrote, "Mark McGowan's premiership will be best remembered for the victory over COVID. But for what it's worth, I think the voluntary assisted dying legislation will be his most important legacy. I think it might also be the legacy of the current Premier and also those members who served in the 40th Parliament of West Australia, whether they supported the voluntary assisted dying legislation or not. It was truly a remarkable time in West Australian parliamentary politics and community advocacy. Thank you for your attendance tonight and supporting the launch of this book. Thank you."
It was only about 4 weeks ago that my own father passed away. It's a seminal moment in everyone's life. He had been ravaged by dementia. Though not in physical pain at the time, we as a family had to navigate so much. We had to sign off forms, dignity of life forms, do not resuscitate forms, and so on. During this time, I was in Perth, he was in Sydney, far, far away, and I had an advanced copy of Minister Buti's book. And I was reading it, and I was covered in sort of a number of conflicting emotions, layer upon layer. One thing it did do was free me up to openly discuss the complex and contradictory nature of those emotions. Of just wanting to hold on to Dad that little bit longer and see him one last time, to knowing that it was time to let him go. So on a personal note, I really want to thank you for what you've done. Please once again join me on thanking Tony Buti. To end, I would like to take a moment to congratulate and thank the incredible team at the Public Policy Institute, especially Ben Perks and Claire Feenan, as well as the Institute's Director, Associate Professor Paul McGinn. Also my wonderful team at the Forest Research Foundation, who assisted a great deal. I want to thank Harriet and her beautiful daughter, who's done a wonderful job tonight. Thank you. I also want to thank and acknowledge the staff within Minister Buti's office. They've been a pleasure to work with. Thank you again to the speakers, and particularly thank you to the community advocates who are here today and who assisted in this incredible piece of legislation. And thank you to the audience for joining us. A final reminder that you can purchase the books just outside. Have a good night, be safe, and be kind to each other. Thank you.